In this video, I'm going to talk about explain about knight's pawn. The knight's pawn basically is the pawn that's in the knight's column. In this case, black is relatively close to be promoting his pawn. Of course, his first move made to move his pawn down. By moving his pawn down, he's only one step away from promoting himself to become a queen. White, foreseeing this, tries to stop this pawn. Now, this may seem to follow a principle that I've explained on the web page itself, saying that if the knight can stand in front of this pawn, it will most likely cause a draw. This is not in all circumstances, because in this case, White's king is too far away from the white knight himself, and thus cannot support it. If White's knight were to move right from the pawn, Black's king can take him, and still allow his own pawn to promote. So why are White's option? If White moves here, he won't prevent his pawn from promoting. If he moves here, it's quite a useless movement. He only prevents the Black king from moving down, but still doesn't necessarily prevent his pawn from promoting. If he moves here, this is the only potential spot where he can take the pawn. But as we all know, Black is smart enough to move his pawn forward onto b1, upon which he can promote his own pawn. Thus, at this point, we see that White has almost no option. Had the king been on d4, c4, b4, he could protect his knight and allow the knight to move over and draw so that Black will be able to take his knight and Black will be in a drawing position. But in some ways, it is true that we need his pawn, but he also at the same time requires the support of his king. Thus, in this position, when Black is to move, our Black king can capture this knight, and this pawn can promote. Now let's start the same position where White is to move. Now, if we always remember the principle that if the knight can stand from the pawn, this game can end in a draw. It doesn't guarantee everything. The principle that the knight must be able to stand from the pawn must always hold. How's that possible? Well, let me show you. Some of you may have noticed this ahead of time. But in this position, the knight can fork the king and the pawn. Now, this might be seen as tactical play simply, but it also shows one principle that always upheld the truth. This knight can actually stand in front of the pawn, or at least prevent the pawn from promoting if the pawn would move down here. Just in this play, he's able to fork both the knight, the king, and the pawn. So he doesn't necessarily need the king's support in this case, but this is one of the very limited cases where he does not necessarily need the support. But one principle always holds true, no matter whether he needs king support or not, is that he must be able to stand from the pawn. Here, he was able to stand from the pawn, and at the same time check both the king and get the pawn at the same time. Thus, he didn't necessarily need his own king support. But in some cases, where we don't necessarily have the same tactical advantage of being able to fork the other side, and that requires the support of the king. But at the same time, you must always remember that the knight must be able by himself, be able to stand right in front of the pawn, and block it that way. Alright, that's all for knight's pawn.